Cellular respiration is the process of breaking down glucose with the help of oxygen to form energy in the form of ATP, which your cells can use. You can think of cellular respiration as being the opposite of photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants take in energy from the sun, carbon dioxide, and water to produce glucose and oxygen. Animals then breathe in that oxygen, which helps them break down glucose, and the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water, thus repeating the cycle. So there's a symbiosis between plants and animals. This is the cycle of cell respiration and photosynthesis. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule of sugar that must be broken down into smaller packets of energy known as ATP before it can be used by cells. Cells can't use glucose directly for energy, which is why it has to be processed and broken down into ATP, which is more appropriate for the cell to use. A cell using glucose would be like using dynamite to blow a door open, when all you have to do is just let yourself in by turning the knob. That's what ATP is. It's just small packets of energy that's more appropriate for the cell to use. Before I continue any further with this topic, let me just give you some reassurance, and that is you don't have to know every single college level detail of cellular respiration. If one day you decide to become a college professor or a biochemist, then yes, you would have to know every single step. But for the purposes of my class, you just need to know the basics of cellular respiration. If you want to know more, you can always look it up in any higher level texts or check out videos like Bozeman Science on YouTube. Cellular respiration occurs in a bean-shaped organelle known as the mitochondria. One molecule of glucose is able to yield about 36 ATP molecules of energy. There are 3 phases of cellular respiration. The first is glycolysis, followed by the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, and the third is the electron transport chain. I'll discuss each one in detail, and we'll look at all the little steps. I'll give you an overview of the 3 phases of cellular respiration. So the first is glycolysis, where glucose is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. So glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, and it gets broken down into pyruvate. And again, I'll discuss each step in detail. I just want to give you an overview first. So during glycolysis, you get a net of 2 ATP. So 2 ATP are produced. Next, what happens is the pyruvate then enters the mitochondria, and it undergoes something known as the citric acid cycle. 2 ATP are produced in this process. And if you look at the formulas carefully, you'll see that 2 pyruvates will produce 6 carbon dioxides as byproducts. So again, pyruvate has the formula C3H3O3, and when it enters the citric acid cycle, its hydrogens and its electrons get stripped. And the electrons are now carried by 2 different molecules, but they do the same thing, NADH and FADH2. So these now enter the electron transport chain, and I'll explain that in detail, but the electron transport chain will produce around 28 ATP. Okay, and water is also given off as a byproduct once the hydrogens, oxygens, and electrons meet up again. To get glycolysis started, the cell has to invest 2 ATP. With the 2 ATP, it's able to break down glucose, which is a 6-carbon sugar, into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon sugar. In the process, it yields 4 ATP, which means the net gain is 2. Notice how pyruvate has the formula C3H3O3. As it enters the citric acid or Krebs cycle, its hydrogens and electrons are stripped and they're transferred to 2 electron-carrying molecules known as NADH and FADH2. In the process of stripping pyruvate of its hydrogens, CO2 is released as a waste product, and you also receive a net gain of 2 ATP from the citric acid cycle. In a little bit, I'll show you a video which helps explain the electron transport chain, but just understand that the NADH and the FADH2 that were produced from the citric acid cycle are carrying electrons through this chain, and it allows ATP to be produced. The electron transport chain occurs in the membrane of the mitochondria. So you're going to see in this first step, NADH, which is carrying the hydrogens and electrons that were stripped from pyruvate, you're going to see it dump off the electrons. So as the electrons are zipping through the membrane, it creates enough of an electrostatic gradient where it allows the protons, the hydrogens, to pump through. Okay, so now that they're on the outside, what's going to happen is there's a high concentration of hydrogens that are on the outside of the membrane. So naturally, it's going to diffuse through. So it falls back down through a protein known as ATP synthase, which is that purple pink protein that you see, and it's churning out ATP. So the hydrogens provide energy for that. And in this last step, you're going to see oxygen come in, and it creates water by picking up the excess hydrogen ions and the electrons. So water is released as a byproduct. There's a really simple analogy that allows you to understand the electron transport chain a lot better. And that is, if you pretend NADH and FADH2, which are your electron carriers, as being someone who's pushing a boulder uphill. Okay, so that's what's basically happening as the electrons are zipping through the membrane. So as the electrons zip through, it creates an electrostatic attraction, okay, that allows the protons to get pumped through the membrane. So it's almost like you're pushing the protons upstream or uphill, and once you get enough of them, okay, they're all just kind of sitting and waiting there. All it takes is just one small push, and then they start rolling downhill. So it does this through the process of diffusion, right? Because there's a high concentration of hydrogens outside, and there's a low concentration inside. So what's going to happen is the hydrogens fall through ATP synthase. So ATP synthase is able to phosphorylate a molecule of ADP and phosphate. So it combines ADP and phosphate into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so it starts churning out ATP. It's almost like a turbine or like a power plant. You can think of it that way. Okay, and it just starts creating ATP. And in one cycle of the electron transport chain, okay, from one molecule of glucose, the electron transport chain produces the bulk of the ATP. It produces something like 80 to 90% of the ATP from one molecule of glucose. And then, of course, at the very end, you have oxygen, which combines the excess protons, hydrogens, and the electrons from the transport chain, and it forms water as a byproduct. Alright, so there you have it, guys. Cellular respiration just breaks down glucose into smaller and smaller pieces. There are 3 phases: glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And together with those 3 phases, you're able to break glucose down into about 30 to 36 net ATP, which your cells can then use as energy. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on Win Biology.